DEPEN. First of all, let me say thank you to Atta Insights for inviting Control Risks to participate in today's webinar. And I'd like to thank all of you for dialing in and participating. Caroline in Hamburg is going to drive the slides today. And I just thought, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Control Risks, I've included a few slides to familiarize you with the company. I won't go through them in great detail now, other than to just stop here on a few basic descriptions. Caroline, if you want to click forward for me.
We can see two screens, so let me just do something here.
Oh,
actually, Caroline, I can see two screens. I'm not the only one. Ahmed, can you see two screens? Oh, now, perfect. Thank you.
Okay,
you're ready now.
Excellent. So just to stop on a couple of descriptive slides of the company, you'll get these slides later and you can read more about Control Risks when you get the slides and the webinar is over. But just to let you know, we are a global specialist risk consultancy. We're about 45 years old. We're employee owned. We have, I believe the next slide says 39 offices around the world and about 3,000 employees. And just to finish my introduction, I'm a partner in the political risk consultancy at Control Risks. And I work with more than 100 political risk analysts in our offices around the world. I've been with the firm for more than 20 years. And prior to the position I have now, I was, among other things, the managing partner of our Moscow office. What you see on the screen right now in front of you is a copy of our risk map, which is our annual flagship forecast of political and security risk. We've been doing that for more than 25 years. And you can imagine now that our map of geopolitical risk has now been completely overwhelmed by the COVID crisis. And I hope to take you through some of that actually in just the next few minutes today. I'm glad to be starting as the first presenter because I want to move with a fairly broad overview of how Control Risk sees the pandemic progressing. And then I'll hand over to Caroline to take us a little bit further. Caroline, if you want to move this forward just a little bit. On to the next one, please. Thank you very much. What you should see in front of you now are 4 different scenarios that Control Risks has devised to describe how we feel the pandemic may develop. And these scenarios are valid, we think, for about the next 6 to 9 months, or in other words, basically towards the end of the current year. This is our second iteration of scenarios since the beginning of the outbreak. And this is basically our way of putting a bit of structure and a bit of a framework around a global phenomenon that really varies from country to country or state to state, or particularly in the US, even from city to city. The scenarios that we feel are behind us, or the ones that are yet to materialize, you can see are grayed out. And I hope you can still read them a little bit on your screens. If not, of course, you'll be able to read them pretty clearly when we send around the deck and the recording. But most importantly, we'd like to point out that we believe we're currently in a scenario that we call prolonged disruption. And the point to this scenario is that we think we've moved far beyond an acute crisis and something that will likely last much, much longer. And of course, this is an unusual situation for companies to be in. A lot of companies can deal with acute crises, whether it's a cyber attack or an earthquake or a hurricane or some other external shock. But most companies are not accustomed to or equipped to deal with a crisis of this sort of duration. So as you look at the features of the current scenario, I just want to make a couple of points about the scenarios beyond that, because clients have been asking us to develop scenarios for recovery. And that's a great sign, and that shows that even at a time like this, it's perfectly appropriate while you're engaged in triage and current crisis management, you have to have one eye or maybe even both eyes on the future. So we have two visions of the future, and one of them shows an uneven recovery, where developed markets, most, but maybe not all of them, bring the virus under control and gradually begin to recover. But the primary feature of this scenario really is that developing countries, developing markets, remain immersed in crisis. And due to lack of state capacity and the limitations to their healthcare systems, they fail to bring the outbreak under control. We also forecast a deterioration of the security situation in those markets. Now, the fourth scenario that's on the far right-hand side of your screen, I hope, envisions a more consistent and uniform global recovery. And as you might imagine, that sees a fairly predictable set of indicators. And by the way, it's not entirely given that we will move smoothly from one of these scenarios sequentially to the next and the next and the next. Now, to track those developments, we monitor a series of triggers. Caroline, if you could move forward one. Thank you. So we track triggers, some of which, in brief, include the following. We look very, very carefully at government actions, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But we monitor these actions particularly as they impact supply chain, but not exclusively. We monitor political stability, particularly in countries where the crisis has extreme political, economic, and social impacts. And we're monitoring the flow of cases in China, outside of China, and again, in developed and developing markets. And the world seems to be looking at China as a bellwether for pandemic management and for pandemic recovery. So what's happening in China is very meaningful to the rest of the world. Although having said that, it's important to say that nobody really knows what de-escalation from the pandemic will look like. I mean, it's safe to say, I think, that it will be slower than the escalation. I mean, basically, we had almost 90% of the world, one way or another, go into one form or another of lockdown, and we had that happen in almost a month's time. It is safe to say that coming out of lockdown will be much slower, and it will be highly fragmented. It'll be different in different countries, in different cities, and in different regions, and even in different sectors. And I know we're going to talk about sector-specific issues very, very soon. What I want to do right now is just jump to the last slide for my part of the presentation and show you what we're looking at when we track government actions. And you can see here a summary of government actions for Southeast Asia, for Australia, South Asia, Northeast Asia, and the Pacific. And that whole chart went almost entirely to red very quickly. What we want to track going forward is the gradual relaxation of these government actions. And at some point, the red will turn to amber, the amber will turn to green, and we want to be able to show business where things are moving and where they're not. There will be a lot of mixed signals coming from politicians, coming from business leaders, and coming from government figures about when we can all go back to work. And making sense of that means understanding where your footprint falls on a chart like this. So we look forward one day to this turning green. Until then, I'm going to turn over to Caroline and let her take you through the rest of the presentation. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very, very much for your time.
Great. Well, thank you, Charles, and definitely I think it's appropriate that it's still red when we're talking about crisis management. So shifting over to the second topic is really what businesses should be focusing on now, and what we're seeing both globally happening, and then also what best practices are that you can be utilizing directly. So my background, as I mentioned before, is in crisis management and also public health. And so we merged those two pieces when we're thinking about COVID and supporting our clients. So I just wanted to jump into these slides here. So how businesses are actually responding right now to COVID. And what this is, it's actually it's the best source I've found so far. It came out not even a week ago, for what companies, the largest companies in the United States, but that can be considered more broadly as well as practices globally, are actually focusing on now and what they're doing above the surface. So if you see that graphic to the right-hand side, it's actually supposed to be an iceberg. And so these policies that are being enacted, whether it's furloughs, whether it's bonuses or financial assistance, it really runs the gamut. And those are the actions that have been taken. And so I invite you to view this from your business's perspective and sort of, you can even benchmark yourself to a degree to say what you're doing in comparison to others, maybe an idea that you didn't have to support both the reputational benefits, the financial benefits, and most importantly, the benefits to your people. So that's everything that's above the water, but really we all know the saying that everything to do with an iceberg, there's 90% below. And this is all of the churning and discussions and decision making and very difficult things happening right now internally within businesses, which is, I imagine, where many of you find yourselves these days, and sort of figuring out what to do, how to say it, and how to move forward. And so what we see with clients is essentially 4 large and best practices come out. And so the first is holistic scenario planning and forecasting. And when I say holistic, I mean across the entire business. So whether it includes, every business is obviously set up differently, but whether it includes your functional and your operational teams, whether you have manufacturing and commercial sides within the same company, but usually probably don't speak to each other. This is the time when all of these pieces have to come together to look at that scenario planning. And that can be best and worst and most likely scenarios. And the language that they speak really should be the same, because the last thing that you want is for the financial planners who are responsible for your fiscal 21-22 budget to be speaking a different language than your operational side, who's actually supposed to be getting the work done on the ground. So that is the key point there. Number 2 is keep prioritizing staff care. I know everyone says this. There's a reason that everyone says this. It's because it's hard, especially right now. The phase that we're in with this crisis is we're having to make very difficult decisions financially about whether the business can stay afloat and how the scope of work can continue. But we really do urge clients to focus on their people, because people are not only your most important asset, it's your duty of care. And so not to forget that in the fog of war, I guess you could say. The third point is to give your CMT a break. So CMT, Crisis Management Team. Most probably every single company of every one of you who's listening to this right now has a crisis management team stood up. So this is usually senior leadership from different areas of the business. It might be your senior leadership team, it might be the board, it might be a combination. But regardless, they've been running 24/7 for months. It is really time to take this opportunity to take a little step back and see and reassess to make sure that everyone is doing the roles that they should be doing. So one common thing that we see with crisis management teams, who, as I mentioned, are on that strategic level, are starting to do very operational, nitty-gritty tactical pieces. And so now is the time to take a breath, take a step back, and really refocus on that strategic decision-making piece, because the steps and decisions that you make right now will impact your business and all of your stakeholders in the years and months to come. And so allow the people below you, delegate that responsibility for that operational piece. In addition, it's time to sort of start phasing out that first step crisis management team. So it's often the case that people just get overwhelmed and tired. And so consider bringing in the alternates, phase them in, get them read up, and then call it a day. And then that third point of give your crisis management team a break is very linked to that fourth point of coordinating your cross-business recovery, because a piece that CMTs are finding themselves grappling with right now is recovery. We're seeing a lot of countries get over the peak. Italy and Spain have just gotten over the peak, we believe. China's obviously there, and we'll see more and more as the time continues. But having a recovery management team in place separate from your crisis management team really is a good business practice to both differentiate someone helping deal with the firefighting and someone doing future planning. And then also really allows you and gives you the platform to holistically look at what your future looks like, how you are recovering, what your resiliency is. And I note the word here for cross-business, similar to holistic. As I mentioned before, it's very important to have everybody's voice at that table, whether they're there directly or whether there are multiple people represented by one head, so you don't have too many people talking at each other. Either way is good. And then I just want to leave you with this last slide, which is the next steps. So looking forward, this here can be the remit of that recovery management team that I mentioned before. But first, what's on essentially everybody's mind is returning to work. And the first thing to say there is that it won't all happen right away. But when you do start changing towards that, it's very important to monitor some of the triggers that Charles had mentioned before, and looking at what the government rules are, whether there's restrictions on certain sectors or certain geographies, and also compliance and making sure that your company is really doing that in lockstep with the government regulations in your industries. The second point here is about changing threat environments. So the COVID crisis is spawning and adding to a series of secondary crises, often regarding security deterioration. And so be very aware. Most of us work in volatile countries, volatile economies, what have you. Be very aware of what's happening in each country that you operate in, so that you can know, you can be nimble and respond accordingly. And also be aware of that uneven recovery that Charles had also mentioned. And finally, just looking forward, your recovery team and also the focus areas that you will be having are not necessarily what you have right now. So for instance, perhaps legal has not been a massive part of your crisis management efforts. However, I would argue that having legal counsel, at least in your head, identified of who that is and where you would reach out to in case of fraud, of conflicts of interest, in disputes, or in force majeure, which Ahmed will be speaking to at length just shortly, is very important to really bring that all together, as well as the standard operational and management functions that you have already. And the last thing I'll just say is many parts of the world are in a little bit farther back timeline than China and other countries, but mostly China. And so take a minute and just look at what lessons learned you can learn from either the other units of your business that work in China or in the Asia Pacific region, or with your peers, to really see about what practices. And what we've found is that people are really willing to talk. So it's an interesting situation where businesses who oftentimes, let's say in the past, didn't want to share best practices, now is a time that people are coming together. So ask, see what you can find out, and then see how you can best use what's already happened for people who have been hit earlier than maybe you have in your geography. So I will leave you with that, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Okay, I'd like you to please stop sharing. And as soon as, okay, perfect. Ahmed, why don't you prepare for your presentation? There's a lot of people here that you've invited and they've been saying hello. So now this is when we get to hear you.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm really looking forward to that presentation.
I'm looking forward to it too. So let me just first share the presentation with
Sure.
you.
Just a reminder for everyone, we are recording this session. You will get access to the materials, so you don't have to worry about that. We'll send you an email with the materials. And perfect, we can see it. On off you go.
let me just come back to the first slide, sorry. Here we go. So,
Yep.
I mean, first of all, I mean, thank you again, Belen, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much, Caroline and Charles, for the wonderful presentation, actually, that you have just made. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending actually on where you are today. So, yeah, 2020 is actually was said to be a record year actually for renewables. I mean, but apparently COVID-19 had different plans for humanity and the sector. So without any further delays, I'll get to the presentation. So my presentation is divided into two parts. In the first one, we will try to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the renewable energy projects under development, then under construction, then under operation. And the second part is more legalistic, actually. It's going to be about the force majeure, whether developers or contractors could claim force majeure as a result of COVID-19, and consequently, whether they could claim reliefs. So different phases of project development, construction, operation, different phases, different issues, and different actually problematics. So for the first one, for project actually under development, these projects may be more exposed to the impacts of COVID-19. Difficulties include, for example, access to the site to assess risks, environmental risks, site risk, or some technical risks, expensive materials and equipments because of the containment measures, because of the lockdown, and all actually this border shutdown. So there's a massive pressure on supply and massive pressure on procuring equipments and materials. The assessment of risks actually by the lenders, I mean, could be also a bit tricky and challenging, because lenders need to have visibility actually on the consequences actually of COVID, so they can price accordingly and price actually adequately and assess the risks. And from a logistical perspective, bringing all project parties together with their advisors online at the same time to meet hard deadlines could be also very, very challenging actually in these times. So all of these factors and other factors actually could result into higher tariffs and not bankable projects. So project under construction, things could be tricky for projects actually under constructions because COVID-19 may result into delays in meeting constructions, milestones, and maybe defaults. I mean, could also cause, defaults under the funding arrangements. This could have several consequences, nasty consequences, I would say. Penalties, loss of incentives, defaults under the finance documents, or even termination actually in some cases. So if there are delays, what would happen? Obviously, the off-takers and the developers and the contractors alike, they may need actually to sit together and to discuss what is the way forward. So they can, well, off-takers and developers, they will try to pass maybe the liability and consequences actually of COVID-19 down to contractors. They could seek reliefs, or they could try to reschedule, the project milestones when it comes, for example, to reaching the commercial operation dates or any other important actually milestones. And on the other hand, developers and lenders may also need to discuss the consequences actually of the delays on their funding arrangements. There could be some defaults under the finance documents. There could be some restriction on utilizations. There could be like a commitment period actually that needs to be the extension, under the funding arrangement. So all of these things actually need to be discussed as soon as possible, I think, with funders. And here, I would like to make, and here actually it's worth mentioning that some international financial institutions, if not all the international financial institutions, have allocated multi-billion packages of fast-track financing to assist private sector companies and governments in their efforts to tackle the consequences of COVID-19. So, so what is the leverage actually when it comes to finance documents? What is the leverage? So actually what is maybe the most important thing actually that we need to take into account actually when engaging into such discussion between actually the lenders and developers? The finance documents, the provision of the agreements, they need to be very robust, and they need to be in line with the best international practices and capable of accommodating different evolving situations. So for projects under operation, the setting is a bit different. I would say it's completely different because the objective source here actually are different from the objective source during the construction phase or during the development phase. during the development phase, for example, I mean, there's no, at the development stage, we don't have a legally binding commitment, but when it comes to constructions and operation, we do have some legally binding commitments with some sort of hard deadlines. So, one actually need to be very, very careful actually about the parties. They need to be very careful about what they already agreed upon in the documents. So when it comes to projects under operation, it's worth mentioning that governments might attempt to reduce electricity supply generated by independent power producers by issuing some sort of regulations and orders, laws. Why is that possible? Well, off-takers and governments might take advantage of two things. The first one is the falling electricity demand caused by actually containment measures. I've been hearing like different news actually all over the world about some governments actually ordering the shutdown of like some power plants. And today actually, I mean, I was reading about India and the demand actually electricity in India, I mean, has fallen by something like 30% or something like in one day. I mean, I'm not sure actually to what extent this is really accurate, but all of these regulations and laws and orders, are they lawfully implemented? What we say, I mean, would this actually constitute a change in law? Most likely, yes. If it ticks all the boxes of a change in law. And like on the other levels, actually, we need also to mention the fact that governments continue to implement new legislations and regulations in response to the consequences of COVID-19. Again, will this constitute a change in law? Probably yes, if it affects the project. Now, to end up with a positive note, actually for this slide, I mean, I would say from a pure operational standpoint, and according actually to what we hear from the market, and this is, I guess, it answers one of the questions actually that I can see like on the Q&A list. From a pure operational standpoint, the market reports that apart from major maintenance, operation can be remotely controlled and employees continue to work from home. So the electricities continue to be produced and distributed to the extent possible. Now, with all the impact of COVID-19 discussed so far, developers and contractors might consider whether they can claim a force majeure actually as a result of COVID-19 and claim reliefs. Well, what is a force majeure? Generally speaking, a force majeure event is an event that is unexpected, beyond the reasonable control of the contracting parties, and prevented from performing its contractual obligation. So under English law, there is no general principle of force majeure, and the agreement shall provide for a clear definition and a clear scope of a force majeure. What would be a force majeure? By contrast, some local laws and some civil law jurisdictions provides for a definition of force majeure. Especially that, for example, in project documents like a concession agreement, like a power purchase agreement, like an interconnection agreement, these agreements are usually subject and governed by local laws. So for example, when it comes to North Africa, Central Africa, or actually West Africa, it's usually the local law that applies to PPA, power purchase agreement, concession agreements, implementation agreements, interconnection agreement, actually, and so on. So I'll come to that actually in a different slides, but whether this, what happens if there's no force majeure provision actually in the documents, actually in the agreement, I'll come to that in different slides. So the force majeure is a risk, and is a risk that should be allocated to the parties, to one of the parties, should be shared among the parties. It needs to be discussed and actually agreed upon in the documents. Whether the COVID-19 outbreak constitute a force majeure events, well, the answer to this question largely depends on the provision of each contract. So say if a force majeure clause clearly covers epidemic or pandemic, then COVID is a force majeure. And if the force majeure clause, for example, covers the acts of government and clearly specifies the acts of government, then the containment measures and the border shutdown are force majeure events. Then actually answering one of the questions here, actually in the Q&A list, if the O&M, if actually the operator cannot get into the sites, would that be can they actually claim or seek reliefs? Depends. I mean, if it is a force majeure action under your documents, you have a chance, you have a shot. So, what about agreements subject to local laws and civil law jurisdictions? But unlike under English law, actually, as I mentioned in the previous slide, there is no general principle of force majeure. COVID-19 might automatically be deemed a force majeure event under the local laws in selected civil law countries. Although the relevant agreements does not expressly cover the epidemic or pandemic, and the agreements does not include force majeure clauses. Because generally speaking, any event which will fulfill the three conditions, an foreseeable event, an avoidable event, an event that is beyond the control of the parties, could be considered and could give anyone who's claiming it a chance actually to stand before the court or actually an arbitration tribunal later on and claim actually a force majeure. So what needs to be checked when a developer or contractor invokes a force majeure in these situations? Well, the party seeking to claim force majeure must show a direct connection between the outbreak of COVID-19 and the impossibility to perform selected contractual obligations. What does that mean? It means that you cannot just throw actually COVID-19 to anything. There need to be a direct link between the COVID-19, its consequences, and the impossibility actually of undertaking contractual obligations. So let's say, if you're actually already in delay actually in constructions, you cannot actually claim COVID-19 like randomly. You would need to demonstrate that COVID-19 is the cause of the delay, for example, in meeting your construction actually objective in construction actually milestones. One should also check the rules for serving the force majeure notice and the content actually of such notices. One need to also check if the developer or the contractor is entitled to any compensation during a force majeure event. This is very standard. This is actually very, very classic. Usually the remedies that we can find in contracts, whether you are in a civil law jurisdiction or actually common law jurisdiction, is that once you have a force majeure, you are entitled to some sort of compensation plus an extension of actually the timeline. If the developer contractor has an obligation, one also need to check if the developers or the contractors have an obligation to mitigate, the force majeure event and the force majeure consequences. Determine whether insurances may cover any of these expected losses caused by the outbreak of COVID-19. And one need to check very, very carefully about the rules governing early termination of the project documents if force majeure persists for a long period of time. Now, the apocalyptic scenario actually for anyone who is claiming force majeure is what happens if there is no force majeure clause or the force majeure clause do not allow any reliefs. What other clauses actually we should look at? You could try the frustration of contract purpose. Yeah, the definition here. You can try the material change clause, or you can also try the hardship clause. So one should look to any of these clauses actually if they are in your agreements. If you don't have a force majeure wording or your force majeure clause that you have in your existing documents do not allow you actually for any reliefs. Thank you very much, and I hope I was on time.
Perfect, Ahmed. Thank you very much. I think there's going to be a lot of questions about force majeure. At least the last webinar in Spanish, it was the whole of word about that. Can you stop sharing the screen, please?
Sure.
So that we can allow Anna, last but certainly not least, because she's talking about money. Everyone cares about money. So Anna, I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself and to share the screen. There's already a few questions there for you, Ahmed, and also Caroline and Charles, so feel free to keep answering. I can see that you guys have been answering, but what happens is usually, we get more and more questions, so please feel free, and then we'll do some, hopefully also live. Okay, Anna, I can see your PowerPoint already, so can you talk for me just to make sure we can hear you?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Belaine, for inviting me to join this venerable panel. And I just would like to say a word to all the people who have joined, because I think we have over 300 incredibly qualified people who have joined. And so first of all, thank you all for joining. And I'm sure your questions will be really interesting. and you may have things you want to add. So please feel free to add in the chat throughout the conversation, and that this should be viewed as a conversation. So I'm going to keep this extremely brief because I think we're running towards the end of our time. And as such, I've kind of winnowed my presentation down just to 3 slides. So the first slide is really to build on what Charles and Caroline went in a much more sort of simplistic, high-level way, but also in a much longer period. So what you see here is 3 curves. On the y-axis, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but the y-axis here, you have impact. Along the x-axis, you have duration. And, you know, I think as discussed, you know, we have, is this a short, sharp shock? Probably not, because we will struggle to figure out how to get out of it. So at the very minimum, we're looking at a yellow curve, right? Oops. And, you know, is that a longer sort of, so the first one is sort of, can we manage the peak infection, find effective drugs, and get back to business as usual sort of by the summer or by the fall? The second scenario sort of says, okay, maybe we can, and we have to wait for a vaccine, and certainly I'm in the UK, I think many of you are as well, where they're sort of warning us it's at least 6 months, it could be a year before we're really back to anything resembling a business as usual. And then in order to be contrarian and to think, kind of push the envelope, because I think often people talk about black swan events, but we actually know what black swans events are. We just rate them as extremely unlikely because we don't like to think about them. I'm going to propose a third scenario, which is the blue scenario, which is that we actually never really go back to business as normal. And what does that mean? That could mean a lot of different things. It could be both in terms of a climate where we just don't get back to the same level of travel. We don't get back because people fundamentally go, actually, I don't need to be in the office. Businesses go, I don't need all that real estate because actually, like, you know, we were out of the office for a year. Why did we do that anyway? All I really care about is a few face-to-face meetings in my business development, right? And so we could see a fundamental transformation of how we do business. And I think the other thing that people are sort of quietly talking about, but not really talking about very loudly, which is this whole issue of the pollution and what that has and the impact on climate change. And we at Ortis feel that climate change is basically the biggest challenge that's facing humankind. And I think many of you do too, because you're in renewable energy. But I would say in many ways, the coronavirus may well be a training wheels for this other bigger crisis for which, you know, if we don't get our arms around it, there may not be an exit. So now, you know, renewable energy from an investor perspective is fundamentally counter-cyclical, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but it will also increasingly depend on government action. And I'm going to go out, and I should add, sorry for the first slide, we're talking about massive, massive uncertainty. Nobody really knows which scenario it is. I thought Charles and Caroline did a fabulous job of showing a whole bunch of triggers and indicators. You could go through that exercise yourself. You could probably ask them to share theirs. But nonetheless, we live in a very uncertain world and it feels much less certain. And as a result, there's a huge amount of volatility, and that volatility is very much affecting investors. Now, coming into this renewable energy, where does renewable energy sit in there? And we've had some great conversations about projects in their various stages, but I'm only going to look through the lens of investment, okay? So first of all, any investor is going to look and go, right, well, where are your revenues? Where's the certainty around revenues? And as we all know, there's really 3 places where you can get revenues. I mean, there's probably some more, but I'm just going to simplify it to 3. The first one is a government-backed PPA structure, whether it's a contract for difference, an auction, a tariff. You know, it could be a lot of different structures, but fundamentally it's government-backed. It's for anywhere from 15 to 20 something years. It's linked to inflation or it's not linked to inflation, but it's got some certainty around it. The second one is corporate PPAs, and the third is merchant. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I fundamentally believe that renewable energy will become very dependent on government action, and government action will happen. I will also say to the 300 people on the phone, it won't happen unless we put up our hands and say it needs to happen. So we all will have to exercise our voices to make sure that it happens. But if we do, I think government will feel an obligation. Already the EU has come out and said, coronavirus is going to take all these actions, but this doesn't mean we're not going to be looking at the Green Deal and the European Directive on climate change. And furthermore, we're going to make green action part of what we do around coronavirus. And I think many other governments will do the same. Now, if they don't, there's really a problem. And that problem comes from two parts. First of all, we can talk about the merchant market, but in general, the merchant market is going to experience increased volatility and increased issues. Prices will go down, especially where it's, you know, based on the marginal cost. Just taking a market as an example, look at Italy. The marginal cost there is really based on LNG, oil-linked LNG, and the prices have dropped significantly, right? Corporate PPAs also have some issues because as companies struggle, you know, the counterparty risk will go up and there will be issues around whether or not those PPAs is as good as you would think. And furthermore, corporates will probably be reluctant to lock into long-term PPAs. You know, already most PPA structures in the corporate, if you find one that's for 15 years, it's extraordinary. They're often 5 years or so, and they could be shorter. But governments will have every reason for renewable energy stimulus because the fundamentals are very attractive. It's crisis resilient, it's energy and logistically independent, and energy independence is going to become increasingly important. And I think you're seeing that. Having to worry about bringing in large ships of fuel, having that managed, having, you know, queue staff there, worrying about the volatility in the market. It's also non-correlated. It's low volatility once it's locked in. It's green and it's cheap, relatively. Now, I cannot talk about this without talking about oil. And again, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say, look, having a low oil price has significant appeal. And in normal circumstances, we would consider that a significant market stimulus. But for right now, it has significant downsides. And I think what we can expect to see, and again, this is becoming on a limb, is significant consolidation. You know, there may be an opportunity for foreign nationalization. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go back and sort of go, okay, let's look at all the different energy markets in the world where there's oil and gas assets, you'll see that in many, many places, if you drew a UTC, a unit cost curve, you would see that a barrel of oil is just too expensive to pull out of the ground right now. And with the amount of production going up significantly, Saudi Arabia is still pumping, Abu Dhabi is still pumping, and actually increased both of them. You know, it creates a situation for those who have very large, significant sovereign wealth funds and want to be oil long to come in and potentially buy up assets that other people want to get shot of as they're not able to extract from the reserves. So in this particular scenario, we have a world in which that volatility, that overproduction is deepening our downturn, right? And the demand destruction that's coming from Corona is so profound that the low oil price has no impact as a stimulus effectively. And people are even talking about we're going to run out of storage. And the third point is, you know, with significant amounts of coal coming off, because many countries have committed to reduce the amount of coal production, it's only if oil ends up being a substitute or fossil fuel backed energy generation ends up as a substitute for renewables, it's only going to be a temporary substitute. And as you'll know, renewables are continuing to be relatively inexpensive and continue to come down the cost curve very quickly. It doesn't mean it won't be a little bit of a hairy time where we may not see some situation where governments or energy companies that run energy systems, particularly where it's centralized into one entity, doesn't turn to, you know, gas generation instead of, you know, kicking off a renewables auction. But I don't think it's a long-term situation, and we don't see countries doing a U-turn on their promises because of the need for stimulus. So the investor perspective partly depends greatly on the investor situation. So we've seen pure play investors where they just want to go straight ahead, Are they screening for quality? Absolutely. Does it depend on the amount of dry powder that they have? Absolutely. But they are still looking for new investments, but they're screening very highly for quality. We've also seen situations where investors are diverse, right? So they may have or an asset manager is diverse, and they may have a liquid portfolio and an illiquid portfolio. And because and they may be performing great in both, although, you know, the stock market is what it is, but their core investors have losses in other places, and they therefore have to liquidate their part of their liquid portfolio, and it may turn out to be such a big deal that it becomes an existential question for the asset manager. So, you know, the investor situation is really the key. And then where people have existing investments and those investments are impacted, obviously triage wherever necessary, you know, funding those investments to keep them going, and the communication, and this is for those of you who are in a position of being an existing investment, you know, I urge you to over communicate to your investors. And again, new investments are being made, but people are screening very, very distinctly for quality. I think the fundamentals of renewable energy remain attractive, as discussed in the previous slide. They're not a correlated asset. With all this demand destruction, they're still attractive. They're still they're quite low volatility, and this is really focused on the assets where there is a government-backed PPA structure. And we still expect to see a huge amount of significant movement from fossil fuels. If you were to take a step back, just 2 months ago, Davos was on, and the biggest takeaway from Davos was, you know, the energy transition. And so there is well over $12 trillion of investment earmarked to move it away from fossil fuels into some form of renewable energy. And finally, for those investors who are in fossil fuels, you know, those are increasingly challenging. Consolidation is, again, as I said, is on the cards, and it's you know, we're looking at a relatively low return environment unless, you know, you're sitting there on a huge heap of dry powder and you want to go oil alone. Let me stop there and open it up for questions. And also questions from the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Anna. If you can just stop sharing the screen so that we can see you guys all in a larger format. Yeah, perfect. Okay, we have a few questions, and thank you so much for doing such a good job, you know, answering this. But I wanted to ask some of them live, if I may. So, okay, one here says, and I'll open it up, but I think it's more directed to you, Ahmed. It says, it seems like it's easy to draw a correlation between COVID and business interruption. Does this mean that it is quite easy to claim force majeure? What type of protections can there be for groups trying to avoid force majeure claims as a way for to get out of responsibility? So, you know, using those because you can. How direct does the link have to be for links to, for people to claim force majeure?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. It's a very, very good one. It's not easy. It's not easy actually to claim force majeure, because then there must be a direct link. There must be a link which makes the impossibility of undertaking a contractual obligations as the direct consequences of COVID-19, which means this needs to be discussed clearly among the parties, because the party claiming force majeure need to demonstrate how COVID-19 and its consequences, or whether the government has taken any border shutdown actions or something, how does that impact the execution of its obligation, like the construction work, you know, the construction work and meeting some deadlines. So a lot of things, a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings, because I mean, people actually would come up like with a list of actions. This is like, this one I can do, this is one I can't, this one I can do, this actually the other one I can't. So this needs to be really, I mean, very, very well discussed actually among the parties. So it's not very, very easy one. And you cannot just, again, the business partner, I mean, the developer cannot just take, cannot just claim actually COVID-19 actually to escape its obligations like that. They cannot really claim actually COVID-19 to cover up on their, I mean, on the fact that they were already actually in delay actually in constructions. So this actually would not work.
So you need a lawyer Contact Ahmed. Okay, I just have a follow-up question that we had in the last, in the Spanish-speaking webinar, but I think it's very relevant here. Someone was asking, where does the buck stop? Meaning, like as a developer, you know, I claim force majeure, so the risk goes with the EPC, but then they claim force majeure, you know, who will be stuck with most of the risk and most of the payments out?
Well, it depends on the document. So, I mean, it depends on the documents. Let's say the developer actually is going to be standing like in between the off-taker in one part and actually the EPC actually on the other part. So let's say, I mean, if the EPC actually is serving a force majeure notice, then actually the developer will need first to confirm whether the force majeure notice and the force majeure claim actually claimed by the EPC contractor is lawful. And if they think actually it's lawful, then they can pass it down actually to the off-takers. And vice versa. I mean, if the off-taker most unlikely actually claim a force majeure event, then actually they can also pass it down. So it's all about passing down responsibilities and risks. And that's why it's very, 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 very important to have a PPA and EPC contractor, which are like mirroring actually each other. I mean, we call it like a back-to-back. So it needs to be whatever risk actually you signed off on in the PPA, they need to be reflected actually in the EPC contract. And whatever you negotiated and agreed on the EPC contract needs to be reflected in the PPA. So it needs to be actually back-to-back. If there is no back-to-back risk allocation, then there might exist actually some gaps. And that could actually lead to very nasty consequences, I would say.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Okay, let's move on. There is Charles, World War I and World War II question for you. You want to just say live, like your short answer? We can't hear you. Just unmute your microphone, please.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, I saw that question, and thank you for helping clarify that. So the question was, do we see, post-COVID, do we see a more global world, or do we see a more nationalist and isolationist world? And I think that we were headed.
Jonathan is an optimist.
Sorry?
Right. Jonathan is an optimist, but how about you?
Well, I take things the way I see them. And I think that even before this crisis, we saw a world that was moving closer to populism, nationalism, protectionism, even before this crisis. And I wonder, I think it's a valid question to ask whether we think that this will act as an accelerant to those trends. And I think you've seen now, just in a couple of isolated incidents, you've seen countries enact economic protection laws that are going to make international cooperation very difficult. And so I think this is something to monitor very, very carefully. We've seen certain anti-democratic measures being taken around the world. We've seen a lot of borders go up where they didn't exist before. And I wonder to what extent politics and economics are going to snap back to the way they were before this crisis. I think it's something worth monitoring very carefully.
So, Jonathan, not everyone is as optimistic as you are. Actually, Jonathan and I are having a back and forth about this, like offline as well. Okay, so a question here. Someone asks, they're from Uzbekistan, and they're asking, renewable energy was becoming one of the hottest spots for investment in renewable, but post-pandemic, investors will most probably become more risk averse, meaning that market interest in Central Asia may drop. I'd like to hear your opinions. What's the future of renewable investment market in developing countries like Uzbekistan, where we are historically dependent on traditional sources of energy? And this probably won't have a lot more time. So Anna, why don't you start and then you guys can add.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I really hate to say it because I would like to be able to say that there won't be much of a slowdown, but I think there's really going to be two factors. One is investor sentiment is going to skew to where risk is, lower, or at least perceived to be lower. And I think the second thing is, and I'm not speaking specifically of Uzbekistan, but I am speaking specifically of many of the developing countries where health systems are, let's just say, less rich and robust. And already, in the richer countries, there's been significant issues with struggling with the peak of coronavirus. And I think, my final scenario, which was life that doesn't go back to normal, and I don't know if people looked at the news, but one part of it was that, we are not going to end up not having COVID or some form of it, that we're going to have continual reinfection because developing countries will probably struggle with the degree to which this virus just is so easy to transmit. You basically just breathe on people. And in a world where, Western countries are struggling to get masks, struggling to wash hands, it's hard to envision that developing countries will not have the same problem, but with less resources. So I wish it were different, but I think, yeah, it will be time. And I think the key there will be two things. One will be government stimulus, and the other one will be international finance agencies, which will, to a certain degree, pick up the investment or continue to push with investment and potentially come with additional investment into developing countries.
Thank you very much. If you guys want to add something shortly, this is the moment because we're going to have to go. So would anyone like to add something? Caroline, no? Charles, no? What about you, Ahmed? No?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Oh, good.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate you guys sharing with us this knowledge, And yeah, I mean, if we were in a conference, I would ask everyone to clap. We're not, so please clap, in your own homes. Ahmed, Charles, Anna, and Caroline, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for all of the audience that are there. And hopefully, see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Everyone, bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.